War rarely spared space for mercy. In the skies over Europe during World War II, mercy was nearly impossible. It was a war of attrition, of machines, fire, and willpower, where hesitation could mean death. Yet in the frozen air above Germany in December 1943, something happened that defied the logic of war. It involved two pilots who should have been enemies. One, an American bomber pilot, struggling to keep his dying aircraft aloft. The other, a German fighter ace, with the skill and right to destroy him. By all measures of the war, their meeting should have ended in flames. Instead, it became one of the most remarkable acts of humanity in modern military history. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had become one of the most brutal and unforgiving campaigns in history. Every day, the skies above Germany filled with the sound of engines, gunfire, and explosions as Allied bombers made their long, perilous flights from bases in England to targets deep inside enemy territory. The 8th Air Force was tasked with a mission that demanded extraordinary courage and endurance. Its bombers, mostly B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, carried out daylight raids against heavily fortified industrial centers, rail hubs, and airfields. The cost of these missions was staggering. Thousands of young airmen never made it home. The survival rate for a crew completing 25 missions was once less than 30%. Among those men was a 21-year-old pilot from West Virginia named Second Lieutenant Charles L. Brown. He was a farm boy who had joined the Army Air Forces to serve his country and see the world beyond his small hometown. Brown had completed his flight training in the United States and had arrived in England only weeks before his first combat mission. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, Brown climbed into his B-17F, serial number 423167, nicknamed Ye Old Pub. The aircraft belonged to the 379th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, based at RAF Kimballton. It was Brown's first mission as pilot in command. His crew, 9 men in all, were just as new to combat as he was. Their target that day was the Focke-Wulf aircraft production plant in Bremen, a critical site for the German war machine. The Luftwaffe's FW-190 fighters, produced there, were among the most feared aircraft in Europe. The goal of the raid was to cripple production and slow the Luftwaffe's ability to intercept Allied bombers. At 8 a.m., more than 500 bombers assembled in the cold, pale sky over England. Below them, the winter landscape stretched gray and frozen. Above, the sunlight glinted off aluminum wings and gun turrets. As the formation reached altitude, the men donned oxygen masks, checked their .5 caliber machine guns, and prepared for the long flight ahead. The temperature inside the unpressurized bomber dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Even with electrically heated suits, frostbite was a constant threat. Communication came in short, clipped bursts over the intercom. Every man knew his role. Every man also knew the odds. Crossing the North Sea was uneventful, but tension built as they neared the German coast. Everyone expected what was coming next: flak and fighters. German radar operators had already picked up the approaching formation. Anti-aircraft batteries and interceptor squadrons were scrambling into position. By the time the bombers reached Bremen, the sky was a wall of black bursts. The air filled with shrapnel and smoke. Each explosion sent fragments whistling through the formations. The pilots fought to keep their planes level and in tight formation, the only way to survive in such heavy fire. As Ye Old Pub approached the target, the flak intensified. The bomber was flying in the low group, a dangerous position that drew heavy fire from ground guns. A shell burst just beneath the nose, sending jagged metal through the front of the aircraft. The explosion shattered the plexiglass nose cone and tore into the crew positions. The navigator, Second Lieutenant Al Sadok, and bombardier Second Lieutenant Paul Enzor were both wounded. Shrapnel ripped through their legs and faces. The blast also damaged the bomb sight and key instruments in the cockpit. Brown felt the shock through his seat. The controls jerked violently as he fought to steady the plane. A second flak burst hit the number 2 engine, setting it on fire. The propeller stopped, and black smoke trailed behind the wing. Brown ordered the engine shut down to prevent an explosion. The aircraft began to lag behind the main formation. Moments later, another shell struck the tail section, killing Sergeant Hugh Eckie Eckenrode, the tail gunner. The blast tore open part of the fuselage, leaving jagged holes where metal once was. Despite the damage, Brown pressed on toward the target. The bomb bay doors opened and the payload of 500-pound bombs fell over Bremen. The crew never saw the results. All they could see was the storm of flak erupting around them. As soon as the bombs were released, Brown turned the B-17 westward, hoping to rejoin the group. But Ye Old Pub was too damaged to keep up. Its airspeed dropped. It began to fall behind the formation, the worst possible situation for a bomber. Stragglers were easy prey for the Luftwaffe. Minutes later, they appeared. A formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s from JG-11 and JG-1 swooped in from the sun. Brown's gunners opened fire. Tracers streaked through the sky as the German fighters dove in. The engagement was one-sided. With one engine out and the tail section crippled, the B-17 couldn't maneuver. Cannon shells tore into the wings and fuselage. One hit blew away part of the right horizontal stabilizer. Another knocked out the number 4 engine. Inside the bomber, chaos reigned. Top turret gunner Sergeant Bertrand Colombe was wounded. Waist gunners Sergeant Lloyd Jennings and Alex Yelisanko fired continuously, keeping the fighters at bay. Radio operator Sergeant Robert Andrews tried to send out distress calls, but the transmitter was damaged. The oxygen system failed, forcing the crew to descend. Below 10,000 feet, the air was dense, but filled with anti-aircraft guns. Brown had no choice: stay high and suffocate, or go low and face ground fire. He chose the latter. At lower altitude, visibility improved. The crew could see the smoke rising from Bremen. The damage to the bomber was catastrophic. The right wing was riddled with holes. The elevators barely responded, and hydraulic fluid leaked from shattered lines. Despite everything, Brown refused to abandon the aircraft. Several of his men were too injured to bail out. He knew if they jumped, the wounded would die. The cold and blood loss alone would finish them. With grim determination, Brown kept his hands on the controls. The B-17 lumbered westward, each mile a battle against physics. When the last of the German fighters broke off, Ye Old Pub was a ghost of an airplane. 2 engines were dead. The remaining 2 coughed and sputtered. Parts of the fuselage flapped in the slipstream. The nose was open to the air, and frost coated every surface inside. The crew tried to treat the wounded. The navigator's leg was badly injured. The bombardier was unconscious. Flight engineer Sergeant Ernest Pinky Pugh crawled through the narrow fuselage to check damage and feed ammunition belts to the waist guns. Brown could feel every vibration through the yoke. The rudder pedals barely moved. The compass was shattered, leaving him to navigate by instinct and rough bearings. The intercom failed, leaving him isolated in the cockpit, with only his co-pilot, Lieutenant Spencer Luke, still conscious but weak from a head wound. For nearly half an hour, the crippled bomber drifted across northern Germany. Below them, snow-covered fields and frozen rivers stretched to the horizon. Smoke from burning towns marked the aftermath of the raid.
Brown tried to keep altitude, but the aircraft continued to lose height. They were now flying at just 2,000 feet, dangerously low for a bomber in enemy territory. Several times Brown considered crash landing in open country to save his men, but the risk of capture was high, and the injured would likely die on the ground. If they could just reach the coast, there was a chance they might ditch in the sea or make it back to England. Fuel was running out. Oil pressure dropped. The cold gnawed through every layer of clothing. Brown's hands were numb. Inside, the crew worked silently. No one spoke of surrender or death. Every man simply focused on staying alive for one more minute. Through the shattered windows, the winter sunlight faded. The mission that had begun in formation now continued as a solitary struggle. At approximately 1 p.m., the bomber crossed near Oldenburg, limping westward. German soldiers on the ground looked up and saw the massive aircraft barely staying in the air. It was clear to anyone watching that the plane had taken enormous damage. By all logic, it should have fallen by now. But somehow, it kept flying. Brown later described the feeling as mechanical survival, a mix of training, instinct, and sheer willpower. The plane responded sluggishly, but it responded. The engines wheezed like dying lungs, yet they held steady enough to keep the bomber airborne. He had no way of knowing that somewhere nearby, a German pilot was about to take off.
That pilot would climb through the same cold haze, scanning the horizon for the crippled bomber. Their paths were about to cross, not in a dogfight, but in a moment that would defy every rule of war. Brown's eyes stayed fixed ahead, unaware that his next encounter would not end with another attack. High above the winter fields of northern Germany, fate was about to bring two enemies face to face, one barely alive, the other armed and ready. And what would happen next would become one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of aerial warfare. As Brown's crippled plane clawed through the frigid air, somewhere below, on a Luftwaffe base near Bremen, another pilot was preparing to take off. His name was Franz Stigler. He was a veteran of North Africa and the defense of the Reich, a skilled fighter ace with over 24 victories. On that winter morning, he was flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, one of the Luftwaffe's most formidable aircraft. Stigler had returned to base after refueling and rearming from the earlier combat scramble. His squadron, Jagdgeschwader 27, had already tangled with the American bombers. The airfield was tense. Ground crews rushed to service aircraft as new reports came in of damaged bombers drifting alone. As Stigler climbed back into his Messerschmitt, his orders were straightforward: intercept and destroy any remaining enemy aircraft. He throttled up, the engine roaring to life, and lifted off into the pale winter sky. Above him, in the same frozen airspace, Charlie Brown's shattered B-17 limped along, engines coughing, control sluggish, altitude falling. Franz Stigler's Messerschmitt Bf 109 sliced through the air as he climbed northward from his base at Bremen. The winter sun was low, throwing long streaks of light across the horizon. Below, the ground was a patchwork of snow-covered fields and small villages, the world looking deceptively peaceful from above. He had taken off alone. The earlier waves of interceptors had already spent their ammunition and fuel. Stigler had rearmed quickly, loading 20mm cannon shells and machine gun rounds, the same type that had torn apart countless bombers before. His orders were clear: find and destroy any surviving stragglers. The Luftwaffe's air defense network had been efficient that day. Reports from observers and radar posts described a single damaged American bomber limping north from Bremen, losing altitude. That was Stigler's target. He expected it to be an easy kill, the kind of engagement that required little effort for a pilot of his experience. At 28 years old, Franz Stigler was already a seasoned fighter ace. He had flown in North Africa under the famous Hans-Joachim Marseille, who had taught him both skill and a particular code of honor in aerial combat. Marseille often reminded his pilots that a man should only shoot when necessary, that victory meant nothing if it lacked integrity. For Stigler, those words stayed with him, yet war had hardened everyone. His unit, Jagdgeschwaders 27, had been decimated more than once. His brother had been killed earlier in the conflict. Many of his closest comrades were gone. Even so, he continued flying, bound by duty and survival. Now he leveled off near 3,000 meters, scanning the horizon. The air was still. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a black smudge against the pale sky, moving slowly, struggling to maintain height. He adjusted his throttle and approached. As he closed the distance, the shape became unmistakable. A Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, alone, its engines uneven, and one of them trailing smoke. The plane was heading northwest, likely toward the North Sea and home to England. Through his gun sight, Stigler could see the extent of the damage. The bomber was torn apart. The tail was riddled with holes. One stabilizer was missing sections of metal, and the rudder hung in shreds. The rear gunner's position appeared empty. No defensive fire came his way. He climbed slightly above the B-17 and banked left, moving closer. The closer he came, the more destruction he saw. The glass nose was shattered. The fuselage was riddled with holes large enough to crawl through. It looked like the plane had already been shot down. It just hadn't hit the ground yet. Stigler positioned himself behind the tail, just out of the firing line, expecting to see the usual flashes of machine gun fire. None came. The tail gun hung motionless, and the barrels pointed slightly downward, unmanned. That was strange. Even the most crippled bombers usually fired back. He inched closer. At about 50 meters, he could see inside. The damage was worse than he imagined. Sections of the fuselage were peeled open like torn metal skin. Through the holes, he could see crewmen inside, tending to wounded men. The waist gunner's window was smashed, and the man at the radio position slumped forward. The pilot side of the cockpit was shattered, yet someone was still at the controls. He moved alongside, keeping formation just above and to the left of the bomber. Now he could clearly see the faces. There was blood, frost, and exhaustion. The crew looked half dead. Some of them were motionless. The bomber's engines were coughing, the right inner one dead, the outer barely running. It was a miracle the aircraft stayed in the air at all. He watched for a few moments. No one fired, no one moved to man the guns. In that instant, Stigler realized what he was looking at. Not a combat-ready aircraft, but a flying wreck filled with dying men. He could have ended it right there. One burst from his cannons would have torn the bomber apart. The crew inside would have never known what hit them. The victory would have counted towards his record. He would have received credit, perhaps another step towards the Knight's Cross. Instead, he hesitated. The sight reminded him of his own brother killed by a bomber earlier in the war. He thought of the men inside the B-17, young, freezing, bleeding. They were enemies, yes, but in that moment they were also just men trying to survive. Stigler edged closer until his wingtip was nearly level with the bomber's tail. Now he could see the pilot, a young man with pale skin, wearing an oxygen mask and helmet, gripping the controls with visible strain. That was Charles Brown. Brown turned his head and noticed the German fighter. For a split second, he thought it was over. His crew couldn't fight back. Their guns were either destroyed or unmanned. He waited for the inevitable burst of fire that would finish them. But it didn't come. Instead, the Messerschmitt stayed there, silent, steady, almost protective. Stigler studied the B-17, flying alongside it for several moments.
He could see how the right side of the nose was completely blown out, and that 2 men inside were still attending to others who were clearly wounded. He was flying beside a ghost. He pulled slightly ahead and tried to signal with hand gestures, hoping to communicate something, perhaps to get them to land. But there was no response. Brown was dazed, focused only on keeping the bomber airborne. At that point, Stigler had to make a choice. He could radio the position of the bomber to ground units. Anti-aircraft batteries along the coast could easily finish the job. That was standard procedure. But as he looked at the shattered aircraft beside him, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He decided instead to do something entirely different, something that would have been seen as treason by his own command. He stayed with the bomber. For the next several minutes, the Messerschmitt flew alongside Yold Pub. Stigler kept his distance, but never left its side. When the B-17 drifted lower, he followed. As they neared the coastline, German coastal guns came into view below. Stigler knew that if the battery spotted the bomber, they would open fire immediately. He positioned his fighter close to the B-17's wing, hoping that ground observers would see both planes together and assume he was escorting a captured or surrendered bomber. It was a dangerous act. If his superiors found out, he could face a court-martial, or worse. But he continued. The 2 aircraft flew together, an American bomber and a German fighter, in formation over enemy territory. Below them, gunners watched, uncertain, and did not fire. As they crossed the coastline near the North Sea, Stigler stayed beside the bomber as long as he could. Once they were far enough into open water, he knew the B-17 was safe from German guns. He could not follow it any farther. His fuel was low, and flying into Allied-controlled airspace meant certain death. He made one last move, looking toward the bomber and giving a small, deliberate nod. There was no radio exchange, no words, just that brief gesture. Then he banked his Messerschmitt away and turned back towards Germany. In the moment Stigler turned away, Brown had felt something almost impossible to describe. Disbelief mixed with a faint, fragile hope. They had expected to die over Germany. Instead, they were still alive, flying a plane that should have fallen from the sky minutes ago. But they weren't safe yet. Fuel was running low. If they couldn't reach England, they would have to ditch in the freezing sea. That meant certain death for the wounded. The B-17 groaned as it lost altitude, the horizon dipping slowly. Brown pulled gently on the yoke, trying to coax more lift from the failing aircraft. Minutes crawled by like hours. Finally, through a break in the clouds, he saw something, a faint line on the horizon. Land. It was the English coast. He radioed for help, his voice weak and cracking, unsure if the transmitter even worked. Static filled the headphones. Then faintly a reply came through. Seething airfield, home to the 448th Bomb Group. They were preparing for an emergency landing. Brown and the surviving crew braced themselves. The descent was rough. The landing gear wouldn't deploy properly, and hydraulic fluid had leaked out during the earlier attack. He decided to bring the bomber in on its belly. The runway loomed closer, the engines coughing. Brown cut the remaining power and leveled out. The B-17 hit the ground hard, skidding across the icy tarmac, sparks trailing from the metal belly. The plane lurched, twisted slightly, then came to a stop at the far end of the airfield. Ground crews rushed forward. When they reached the wreck, they were stunned. The B-17 was riddled with holes, the fuselage almost shredded. It looked like it had been hit by everything the German military could throw at it. Flak, cannon fire, and fighters. Yet somehow it was still in one piece. The medics pulled the wounded crew out one by one. Brown refused to leave until everyone was accounted for. His face was pale, his flight suit stiff with blood,
but he stayed near the wreckage until the last man was carried away. In the debriefing that followed, intelligence officers listened to Brown's account with skepticism. He described the formation attack over Bremen, the 379th Bomb Group flying in tight formation, the German fighters swarming them, the flak bursts tearing through the sky. He told them how Ye Old Pub had taken direct hits, lost 2 engines, and fallen out of formation. He recounted the attacks from enemy fighters that riddled the plane and killed his tail gunner. And then he described the lone Messerschmitt that approached from behind. Brown said the German pilot had every chance to destroy them, that he had closed in, flown alongside, and then escorted them out of German airspace. His superiors exchanged uncertain looks. The official stance at the time was clear. German pilots, especially experienced aces, did not show mercy. The story seemed impossible. But Brown insisted. He could have finished us, he said. He didn't. The officers took notes, filed the report, and moved on. There were other missions, other crews, other losses. The war didn't pause for miracles. Still, the story stayed with the men of Ye Old Pub. Some of them talked about it quietly in the days that followed, each trying to make sense of it. The idea that an enemy had spared them defied everything they had been told about the war. Across the continent, in Germany, Franz Stigler went through his own quiet reckoning. He landed his Messerschmitt at his base and rolled to a stop on the tarmac. Mechanics swarmed around his plane, checking ammunition, refueling, asking about his patrol. He said little. He gave only the minimal report required, that he had flown, seen no targets worth engaging, and returned. That night in the pilot's mess, he kept to himself. Other airmen shared stories of combat, of bombers destroyed, of near escapes. Stigler drank his coffee in silence. He didn't tell anyone what he had seen or what he had done. He knew the consequences if he had. Escorting an enemy bomber out of German territory could have been interpreted as treason. The Luftwaffe was unforgiving towards any action that could be seen as aiding the enemy. Yet Stigler felt no regret. He knew he had acted according to the code instilled in him since the earliest days as a pilot. He had been taught that a defenseless opponent was not an enemy, but a man to be spared. Shooting down that bomber, in the condition it was in, would not have been a victory. It would have been murder. In his own way, Stigler continued to serve as before. He flew more missions, faced more bombers, survived more close calls. The war ground on, growing darker, more desperate, and less bound by any code. But that moment, the sight of the crippled B-17, the wounded men inside, and the decision to let them live, stayed with him. Back in England, Brown recovered slowly. His crew returned to duty, some sooner than others. The story of the German fighter became a quiet legend among airmen, passed around between missions but never officially acknowledged. The B-17 itself was too damaged to repair. It was stripped for parts, its bullet-riddled fuselage left on the airfield as a grim reminder of how thin the line between life and death could be. Brown continued flying missions until the end of the war. He was promoted, decorated, and respected. But the memory of that day, December 20th, 1943, never left him.
It wasn't until the late 1980s that the details began to surface. Charles Brown, by then long retired from the U.S. Air Force, started searching for the German pilot who had spared his crew. The moment had haunted him for years. Through veterans organizations and newsletters, he began recounting the incident, carefully describing the markings of the enemy aircraft, the location, and the date. In 1990, word reached Franz Stigler, living quietly in Canada. He recognized every detail. The damaged B-17, the decision to hold fire, and the salute he had given before turning away. It all matched. When the two men finally connected, the accuracy of their recollections astonished historians. Records from both sides confirmed their encounter. Mission logs from Brown's squadron aligned precisely with Luftwaffe patrol reports and weather data for December 20, 1943. The damage assessments on Ye Olde Pub matched what a close escort would have observed. Even the trajectory of the crippled bomber's return to England corresponded with the path Stigler had flown alongside. Researchers later corroborated additional details using Luftwaffe archives and U.S. Army Air Force's mission records. Both men's accounts held up under scrutiny, consistent, modest, and without contradiction. Historians have since described the event as one of the most verified instances of chivalry in aerial combat. There were no witnesses besides the men themselves, yet the convergence of independent documentation from both sides leaves little doubt it occurred exactly as told. When Stigler was asked years later why he hadn't pulled the trigger, he answered simply, "I didn't want to have to live the rest of my life with that on my conscience." What began as a brief encounter in the frozen skies over Germany became a quiet testament that even in total war, humanity could survive above the clouds.